Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Career Upgrade podcast. I'm really excited today because we have a special guest who is the Director of Engineering at GitLab. His name is Wayne Haber. So welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we are going to discuss your experience with IT careers because you started in IT some time ago, right? I noticed you were the CTO at MSI or the 1990s. So you have a rich career in IT. So why don't you start first with how did you actually start with your career in IT?
Yeah, it was definitely a fun start. Is when I started, it was actually my second real job out of school. I was the second engineer on a team. And it was at a company that had about 40 people, but most of them were consultants to the company's customers. And they started to see the company decided to hire some engineers to not do consulting as they started to see similar needs across many of the customers. And these were mostly hospitals and healthcare organizations. And they wanted to create a product that would meet the needs of many of the customers. And when I started, nobody was really organizing the work. And I was 2 years out of school. Nobody was organizing the work. Nobody was figuring out what the priorities should be. We were all just kind of working. We had started with 2 people, and then we got to 3 or 4. So I just started organizing the work of the team and figuring out what the priorities should be because nobody else was. And I realized I really liked it, and then started figuring out how to hire people, how to organize work, how to prioritize things, how to make trade-offs, et cetera. And eventually became the CTO of that company. And we hired, I think the engineering team a couple of years later was 40 or 50 people. And then we were acquired by a larger company. So it was a fun ride and a big success and a lot of fun along the way. It involved including driving to customers. There's often the startup didn't have the money to fly, and many of our customers were regional. And where I was sitting in the back of the car of the chief revenue officer, the person in charge of sales, writing code in Visual Basic for a feature we thought that prospect might like while we're driving there, and asking him to stop hitting bumps so I could actually hit the right keys on the keyboard.
Visual Basic, good old days, right? And you mentioned a few interesting things, and I guess the path is a dream job or dream career path for many of our listeners. To start as a developer, then progress to a tech lead, a CTO, and then exit a company or get acquired. So that's certainly something a lot of developers want to pursue. What would be your advice for developers who are just at the beginning of their career? How should they even think about a career and get to a level where you are at?
So what I'd say is work on what is important for your current employer, of course, but work hard also to figure out what really is important. Not just what the current work is in the short term, but also think about the long term. So, it might be you're working on features of a system and, there's a 3-month looking forward roadmap. It might be great to look at what would happen if the company really succeeds and gets 10x more users in, 6 months. What would the scalability needs be? Also think about the security side. Is how do you secure the system? What's the threat modeling? What are the attackers after? And what things should the company be paying attention to in order to be proactive about preventing those? And then also not getting too stuck in one language or architecture. It's always great to get exposure. So if you're a Ruby on Rails developer, maybe you want to learn a little bit of PHP. Or if you're a Java developer, learn something in Go or in Python. And not just when it comes to technology, software development, the programming languages, but also architecture. So if you've gotten a lot of exposure to relational databases, maybe get exposure to some NoSQL stores. If you're very specific, your knowledge is very specific to Amazon, AWS, look at what Google has to offer and do a little test project there, or look at what Azure has. So you get that exposure and understanding of what's out there, so you can compare and contrast things and don't get pigeonholed in specific technology, so you can help to expand your career.
So it's the diversity of experience you suggest? And is this also something you interview for when you are now hiring developers to join GitLab? Do you look for at least diversity specifically?
We definitely look for various aspects of diversity. So we do look for specific skills. We want people to hit the ground running. That's very important to GitLab and to my team. So we have teams that work primarily in Ruby on Rails, and we definitely do a technical test for Ruby on Rails. We have other teams that work on the front end. We do a front end test. We also do a little bit in Go, and also now starting a bit in Python. In terms of things like, we always want all the candidates to understand computer science basics. So like we don't do tests on big O notation, but we do ask questions around that are in and around that. We talk about security, with how they've secured their components and what the threats are. We talk about scalability. It's very important to us to make sure that we're hiring people that have knowledge on how to scale systems, because GitLab is definitely has a lot of scale in terms of the number of users and transactions done.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And it's interesting you mentioned the diversity of experience. Now I'm thinking about it from the recruiter's standpoint, because sometimes we recruiters visit developers' profiles on LinkedIn, or we see their CVs, and they list all the technologies they have ever encountered. And from my standpoint, it's like, gosh, like it's impossible for him to really know it all, because it's just too many. Or maybe he knew it 10 years ago, but he cannot really remember it. Like you mentioned, Visual Basic, right? But sometimes they list some individual libraries. Sometimes it is a programming language they used 10 or 15 years ago. So where I'm heading with this is how to find balance, how developers should also help recruiters or hiring managers eventually, like you, to understand that they have diverse experience, but at the same time highlight what are their core strengths.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I definitely gloss over and roll my eyes a little bit when I see resumes with a zillion technologies on them. Because as I agree with you, not everybody can know everything about everything. So, but people want to talk about all the things they've been exposed to and they have experience with. And what I would recommend is look at what the job, make sure look at what the job description, the JD, has in terms of its requirements, and look at your skills. And any organization that is going to look for exact specific skills in many, many, many different areas is probably not a place that's great at doing recruiting to find the people they need. And I wouldn't have low confidence if you have, let's say they ask for 6 things and you have 5 of them or 4 of them. They're not going to find anybody they're going to find very few people that have all 6 and are experts in all 6. Mm-hmm. Tell them. And I'm not a big fan of customizing resumes, that candidates should customize resumes for each job. However, I am a fan of writing a short cover email or cover letter of saying, here's what I saw in your job listing. Here's what I've done a lot of. Here's what I would need to learn. Here's what I'm excited about. Here's why I like the company. And not a lot, maybe a paragraph, but it shows the recruiter and the hiring manager and the hiring team the level of interest, and that you've really looked into things and you think you're a good fit. And I think if a company says, oh, this person said they only have 4 of our 6, we're not going to hire them, that's probably not a place you want to work in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is probably some space for follow-up questions, some assessment or self-assessment questions to identify if they are a good match for those other areas, as you mentioned. So interesting indeed also with these customized resumes, because in other areas of our lives, there is more and more customization or personalization, but the resume is usually just the same, right? Like we receive, and sometimes it's even quite funny when one candidate applies for 3 different positions and he's a good fit probably to one of them, not even one of them, but he still applies even for completely unrelated positions. And sometimes I'm wondering, like, if a customized resume wouldn't be better, because then it would probably immediately reveal if he has the right level of experience or not. So how do you handle this inflow of candidates? I'm sure in or at GitLab you have gazillions of candidates applying to work for such a cool and awesome company. In the IT development world, it's one of the coolest companies to work for. So how do you how do you organize the hiring process? How do you find those who will really make it through the interview process?
It's a great thing is we're very transparent about many things at GitLab, and including the hiring process. We're not transparent about every detail of everything, of course, but much more than most companies. So what we do is that, and what I do is that we start with a really good job listing of describing what the role is, what GitLab is, what you'd be doing, and even having a short video, 1 minute video from the hiring manager describing the role. And many people will not read a job description, but they will watch a 1 minute video, which is great to get a feel for it, to see if they're interested. And then when we put the job listings out on our own website, we put them out on LinkedIn. I think we then encourage team members, employees to post them to the social media, because it's great to get referrals. We also post them internally. We then also do sourcing, active sourcing. We'll reach out via LinkedIn Recruiter and Twitter and other things to reach out to candidates. And when we do, similarly, when candidates come inbound, it's great to hear why they're interested. We tell them, hey, we saw your LinkedIn and we reached out to you for these reasons. You have experience in machine learning and Python, to show that we actually read their LinkedIn. And it's not just a form email by a bot. Then when we get the resumes in, whether they're because we've reached out to the candidates first or they've reached out to us first, I'd say what I first look at is we have a screening process where we look at the resume and a cover letter, if there is one, or cover email, which is fine, doesn't need to be a formal letter, is look at, do they have the base information, base experience that we're looking for? Do they meet the bare minimum? And then we look at how applicable their experience is to what we're looking for, not always the same thing. So it might be, they have Ruby on Rails, which is great for a role, but we're looking for somebody with a security background as well, or interest in security. So separate things. We also look at, or I look at, I don't look at the resume in a huge amount of detail other than skimming through, but I do look for attention to detail. So if I see lots of grammatical mistakes or the formatting looks really bad, a couple of mistakes here and there is just fine. GitLab recruits all across the world. And sometimes, English is not the first language of many candidates. So, a couple of grammatical mistakes are not a big deal. But if it looks, a lot of mistakes are. So I use it myself. I use this system called Grammarly. And I'd encourage, which gives you really good feedback on your writing. And I'd actually encourage candidates, if it's economical for them to do so, to use it as well. It really helps to improve, find common mistakes in writing. So it's looking at the resume, and then we make a decision. The resume really has two purposes. One is, and the cover letter is, get your foot in the door and pass the screening level. And then people will cherry pick, all the interviewers cherry pick the things in the resume to ask questions about. So that's a good reason to not put technologies in or things in you're not confident in, because somebody might say, oh, I know something about, I talked to a candidate yesterday that knew both MySQL and Postgres. And I happen to know MySQL really well. So I decided, even though we don't use MySQL at GitLab, we're primarily a Postgres shop, I asked the candidate about MySQL. And it turns out they knew quite a bit about it, which is great. But I zoned in on that because I could ask questions about it. We then, after the screening process, we have a very structured process where we have a list of questions that we ask each interviewer to cover, or areas, less questions. And then they actually vote after the interview with detailed notes on how they did on each one, on diversity, on computer science, on resilience, on many, many different criteria. And we also do a technical test. And the technical test, we're not fans of, code live right now while we watch without any preparation. So what we do is we send the candidates some code and say, this code has some problems and it needs some enhancements. We send that a couple of business days before. The candidate works on it in advance. We submits it to us in advance. We review it in advance, and the interview is actually talking through the changes, not as much the actual changes, but talking through them. At the end of the process, we then look at all the scorecards on how everybody voted, and we try to not let interviewers see other interviewers' scorecards to keep them fresh. And then the hiring manager makes a decision based on that. And the level of the different votes where it's strong no, no, yes, or strong yes. Those are the 4 votes. And strong yes is a high bar. And right now we have because we want to make sure we're keeping a hiring bar high at GitLab, is candidates actually need to get 2 strong yeses from people in engineering, from engineering interviewers. That's a pretty high bar. But it works pretty well to make sure we find people that are really good fit for the company and that we're a really good fit for them as well. So they'll be successful and happy at the company.
Very cool, very cool, very structured and thorough process. You mentioned Grammarly, and I would just add a simple short note that they also have a free version. So there is no excuse for candidates not to use it anymore. And you also mentioned a few really cool tips candidates can apply right away. For example, the cover email, right? This is quite rare in my experience. Probably for some other positions, non-IT, it's more common, but in IT, developers usually don't, right? So as soon as they do, it stands out in the crowd. And you mentioned also 1-minute video that you record for or to describe each role. So would you also expect the video from a candidate?
I have not seen that, but if the candidate provided one, even if it wasn't polished, I think I would definitely look at it. I have not seen that, and I would agree with you. In terms of cover letter or email, it's maybe 10% of candidates do that, but I almost always read it. I've never seen a video. I'm sure people do it occasionally. Sometimes we'll see like on our UX team, which is not when I work with the UI UX teams, but not they don't report to me, but they'll often like send examples of their work to show that they're proud of. There's not really a video, but more visual type things, which is great, or a link to their website with a portfolio. But I haven't seen videos from candidates. But if there was a short video, I would definitely watch it. Yeah, and if it was really, really polished, like it was obvious, they re-recorded it 50 times before it was perfect, that would be okay, but that would kind of concern me a bit if it was more, hi, I saw your job listing. I think it's interesting. Here's why I think I have these skills in Ruby and Rails and Python, and I really like the company because of X, Y, and Z. Please take a look at my resume. I would actually really appreciate that.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. So I guess just more and more candidates will from now on create these videos. Hopefully, just in general, not for GitLab. Okay, cool. Looking at my notes, and we now discussed your hiring process. So candidates have a good idea of what they can expect, but why should they actually join GitLab? What would you say is a difference? Because these days, software developers can work remotely for any company around the world. So why should they even consider GitLab?
That's great. Great question to ask. Is we sometimes, in any company, you have a bias towards your own company. So it's a great way to really, it's a great question to ask, to think about that. I'll tell you why I appreciate it and why I think my teams are happy combined is that we not only work where we allow people to work from basically wherever they want, but also we're very big fans of asynchronous communication. So we don't rely on meetings. So although we do have them, they're secondary or tertiary. We communicate via merge requests and issues. And when we do have meetings, we not only have an agenda and notes and things to review beforehand, but we record them and we take really good notes during them. So people don't need to attend a discussion in order to participate in it, which is great. So you can work the time, we measure success based on results, not based on hours. And that's easier, it's very easy to say, but it's very hard to actually do that in practice. And we do that. We're also very, very, as you mentioned, very, very transparent. And both externally to the public, but also internally, is you get access to all sorts of things. So you can really, one, do your job, but two, really learn. I've learned so much at GitLab. whether it's working with people on the sales team or really collaborating with the product management team or working with the social media team. I've learned so much about how they work and what they do, and it's really helped me to do my job better and just learn fun and interesting things. It goes all the way to the company has a CEO shadow program where any team member, who I think has been at the company more than a certain number of months, can actually shadow almost all of the CEO's meetings and take really good notes in those meetings, not only to learn, but also to help out. And, you know, for a company our size and on our trajectory, learning opportunities like that are great. It actually inspired me to create my own shadow program. So I actually started a engineering director shadow program just a couple of weeks ago. And now 2 people have signed up. None of them have done it yet. They've signed up. And I learned just so much when I did the CEO shadow program with the CEO Sid that I wanted to, you know, do something similar where people can see things at a different part of the organization. So learning opportunities, the ability to work at times that work for you rather than times that are dictated to you is great. I'd say it's also the borrowing a term, I think, from the book about Netflix. We have very high talent density. I learned so much from my coworkers and my peers and my teams. It sometimes really just astounds me that, you know, what a great team we have and how much I learn from people and how much I can depend on my coworkers as well.
I can imagine these shadowing programs are very useful, just because I also joined one. It was already, I don't know, 15, 17 years ago. And I still remember how the director was just explaining me something that I didn't understand at all back then, but it was really like transforming experience. So definitely encourage listeners to consider something like this. And now when we just consider someone who probably is not there yet to pass the high bar. You mentioned you have the bar very high with a few really strong yeses required. So some of the developers out there maybe a little too junior, you know, yet they are looking for a new opportunity. So GitLab may not be the right fit for them, but how should they even think about their next job? How can they find a company to work for now when they can work for any company around the world? So how should, you know, what criteria should they consider?
I'd say the criteria they should look at is look at what they think would be good for their career. So I would look at a number of job listings across many companies. Look at what they're looking for, not because you necessarily want to work there at any of them, because you want to see where the industry is going. So look at what skills are needed, what cloud providers they look for, what technologies they look for, and think about learning those things. So do there's lots of great training for free on on YouTube. People put out great stuff, but also I'm a big fan of Udemy as well. Where they have great classes out there on various topics. And just a note on Udemy is often the prices spike up and then go back down to 90% lower. So if you're interested in a class, if you wait a couple of weeks, it might be much less expensive, from like 50 US to 10 US. So I usually wait until it's much less expensive. I've learned quite a bit from classes on Udemy. Some of them are not so good, but some of them are absolutely awesome. And to look at skills, look at what companies are looking for, and really evaluate the companies, which is hard to do. But talk to the people that are there. Look at the online sites that allow you to review companies, but know that those are very tightly managed and monitored by the companies. And so they want to have a good reputation. So, look at the pros and the cons that those show, but I take that with somewhat with a grain of salt, and understand how they're perceived. And something that I've done is I've looked on LinkedIn at my contacts. So I try to build a good network in LinkedIn. And before I go to a company, I will look to see if I know anybody who knows anyone who's left that company. And then reach out to them saying, hey, I'm thinking about working at company X. I saw that you left there, a year ago. Would you recommend? And if you have a relationship or you can create a relationship with that person, that's a great way to get a feel for that company and to value, not only when you are interviewing there, are they looking at you, but you Interview them. Ask them what the learning opportunities are. Ask them the hard questions. They're going to ask you the hard question. Ask them the hard questions. It shows you're very interested. Why? What are the big challenges at the company? Is a good question. Is like, what are the learning opportunities? How often do you promote from within? How often are what's the team attrition rate? Voluntary and involuntary attrition rate. Ask those questions. Like, what are you working on as a company to improve culture? Those are great questions to ask, and it's a great way to get a feel for the company. And if you get no answers to those, I would say that's definitely a yellow or red flag. If you get well-rehearsed answers to those, I would be potentially concerned about that as well, because it would show they're not being super transparent. But if you get just honest answers, even if they're not great answers, if you get honest answers, I think that says a lot about the company and the hiring manager.
Mm-hmm. And I'm really glad you mentioned that they should interview the hiring manager. Or sometimes I think like at least ask one question, because it's so awkward when developers don't ask any question, right? Like sometimes the hiring manager gets back to me as a recruiter saying like, hey, Michael, this developer is probably not a good fit because he hasn't asked a single question during an interview. So
that is one of our criteria. Again, is we definitely make time for questions from the candidates, and if we don't get many, or the ones we get are not just insightful questions, that's usually something we think about before making an offer. If you're concerned about what questions to ask, look on the internet. What questions should you ask during an interview? You might ask about what things you're interested, but if you're stuck on questions like, what agile processes do you use? What are your performance challenges? With the system? How has the team grown? How long has the manager been on the team? What did they do previously? Those are just great questions. And if an interviewer gets unhappy with you asking questions like that, that's probably not a place you want to work for.
Yeah. Very, very cool questions. And I guess well, it's hard to say. Like, I assume you didn't have like all these questions in mind while you were looking for the first job. So I'm just thinking, what would you do differently if you say were 20 years old again? What advice would you give yourself in hindsight?
So what I'd say is that it's very easy to become complacent in a job where you come in and you do your work every day and you see the progression, but then not keeping sight of the long term, both in terms of your career direction and also your morale, your happiness. So in the distant past, not recently, I was actually that same company I mentioned that was early on in my career. We were acquired by a larger company. And that was a good thing. It was a good synergy, but the cultures were so different and somewhat incompatible with how I like to work. But I still stayed there for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And after the first year, I was miserable. I was really unhappy. But I stayed 2 more years later because, one, I believed in the team and in the product. But I started to see the team leave slowly over time because they weren't happy. And the product started to go in a direction that really I wasn't happy with because it wasn't meeting our customers' needs in the way that I thought we should. And I stayed because they were paying me to stay, and I should have left earlier and moved on to something else because I was just really unhappy for quite a long time. And life is short, too short to stay in a job you're unhappy with. I'd say also is keep track of your skills. There are many engineers and developers, who learn a technology and it works really well with that company and it's really needed by that company. But then that company gets behind where the industry is going. And then you get stuck with skills that were great at that company, but are very rarely needed. So that's a good reason to look at what the job listings are looking for and just learn something new just for fun. Mm-hmm. If you've been working in relational databases for a long time, or that's what you learned in school, learn a NoSQL database like Mongo or Bigtable or other thing, or other related things like Redis. There's great online tutorials for them just to get a feel. It's like, aha, I knew relational databases with structured data. These things don't have structured data. Wow, that's really interesting. Or learn a different language. Like when I started at GitLab, I didn't know Ruby on Rails. And I took a Udemy class in Ruby on Rails to learn it. And it was a lot of fun. And I thought, well, there's these things called routes. What's a route? And I hear people talking about that, and now I really know what a route is. Turns out routes are not only a thing used in Ruby and Rails. I've recently taken a class just because I found it fun in, I'm probably never going to use it professionally, in Flutter for mobile app development. And Flutter uses routes too. And like, aha, this is a pretty cool concept. So things like that. It's continue learning and seeing what the industry needs and not getting stuck with something that may not be used in a couple of years, and then feeling very anxious about learning something new. If you're always learning new things, especially when it's low pressure to do so, you can really lower your anxiety when looking for new jobs, and also really create opportunities for yourself in the future.
Yeah, it really resonates with me, because I know of other people who just stayed in a job for a little too long, and some people who probably just prioritized 500 euros on their monthly salary over some great learning experience. So say this is after someone works in a company for some time, right? Like how to identify this tipping point when to start looking for a job. But what should do those developers who are now they have decided that they are about to leave a company, or they just finish a boot camp and now they just go through Indeed.com or Monster.com and they see thousands and thousands of openings, and they are just wondering, like, how do I decide which company to join, because there are so many full stack JavaScript developer positions out there?
Yeah, what I'd say is first is have a critical eye when looking at the job listings. If it looks too good to be true, or even if it doesn't, is look at the poster, look at where it's coming from. And, there's a lot of identity theft that still happens with job listings. So, and, companies need a lot of information to interview someone, especially to hire someone. So be careful of that and be skeptical before you give your information. In terms of evaluating the companies, there are so many out there. And it's looking at your risk, what's acceptable risk level for you. So do you want to work at a startup with 10 people where the potential for significant growth is great, but the potential for it failing completely is also high? Or do you want to work for a more established company, a Fortune 1000 company that is more established, and you'll have more support, but you'll be a small fish in a big pond, which for some, that's really great. Like they want to make sure they have the stability of health insurance and know that in 3 months they won't have to go find a new job due to the company going out of business. But those big companies also do layoffs from time to time as they reorganize, or they move people around more often, perhaps without the team members or the employees having a choice in that. Although small companies do that. So it's looking at your risk profile. It's looking at what they're looking for and where they're going, and how progressive they are and how progressive you want to be. So it might be that they're looking for team members that know, or employees that know specific skills, and some of them, but you want to know them better. That's a great opportunity. So you get real opportunity to learn it. Or you see open source projects the company releases, and you're a big fan of that. Or you see what they're doing in diversity and inclusion and belonging, and really like what they're doing from an inclusivity perspective. Those are really important things to feel good about your job. You spend so many hours a day in your job. So it's important to be happy with what you're doing and seeing it move forward. Like I was talking to a candidate, friend of a friend of a friend the other day, and he asked me the same question, like, what should I be looking for? And I talked to him, I was like, what's important to you? He's like, I want to make a difference. That's what he said. He wants to make a difference. And like, in what kinds of things? And he told me the kinds of things. And I'm like, well, that's great. And, he does not want to work for a startup. He's early in his career, just got out of school. He wants to work in a company where he can make a difference. So I believe he decided to go to a company that's somewhat established and works in solar power. And that's great. He feels really good about that. He got higher offers for more money from other places, but as for companies he didn't really believe in the direction, at least it didn't really resonate with him. So I think he's really happy there.
And that's a great suggestion, because there are so many rather boring projects out there, right, to create some simple websites. And at the same time, there are so many cool companies, like you mentioned, that make the world a little better place, right, through their I know, reduction of pollution, or they improve the life below water, etc. And they also need IT professionals, right? So that's a great recommendation for software developers to look at the impact as the friend of yours. Okay. So we pretty much covered the whole IT career journey, from someone who is about to just start looking for a new opportunity, through someone who is already in a job and wondering, or maybe feeling a little miserable and wondering what's next or when to go for the next step, up until someone to probably join GitLab, right? You have the bar high, but I'm sure some of the listeners will visit your careers page just to check out what's new over there. Is there any last recommendation that would you like to give to someone who is now considering some career change and wonder what to do next? Like some of your best tip or recommendation that comes to your mind?
Because always be interviewing. Because even if you're happy in your job currently, you might not be in 3 months or 6 months. So when you look at the job listings, subscribe to updates from LinkedIn and Monster and Indeed, et cetera, and look at them. And if something looks interesting, potentially think about applying. Because in the future, you might not be happy, or you might, the company might do layoffs, or might reorganize and put you in a job you don't like, or et cetera. And it's always great to have those things moving along and going, so you feel confident in them. So when you do need them, it's muscle memory and second nature. And rather than it being a stressful time of, oh my gosh, I need to find a new job, it's always great to be on the look rather than them looking at you. Additionally, I would continue talking to your friends, people who've left the company, colleagues from school, et cetera, on how they're doing and what they're happy about, so you can know what's going on in the industry, but also like what kinds of things that what kind of are the best ways to organize engineering work and IT work, and what vendors are being used. So you can really get a feel for that and an understanding of it. How I found GitLab, I'll give you an example, is I wasn't planning to leave the company I was at previously, is we were a customer. And the team using it was ecstatic about it. They loved GitLab as a product, and like, that team is ecstatic about nothing. They don't like anything, but they like GitLab. So I should take a look at them. And then I went and looked at the company, and I saw an article about the two co-founders and how they started out at the very beginning with all remote and transparency to the public being the key value. Like, that really resonates with me, and started talking to them. I didn't start working at the company till quite a bit later, but that's how I found out about it, is because an internal team was using it and was really ecstatic about it. So it's talking to people and understanding what they're excited about and interested in, because those might really inspire you in terms of what you want to do, either at your current company, in a different team, or in a different role, or at another company.
Yeah, I'm always binge reviewing, as you say. And it comes back to what you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, when you mentioned developers should also network on LinkedIn, right? And it also helped you to get one of your jobs. So definitely something to dedicate time and energy on. Okay, cool. Thanks a lot for your time and all these valuable insights. We will transcribe it and also publish on a website, because these tips need to be shared with all software developers who are on the lookout. So thanks a lot. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you. And last plug for GitLab and hiring is that we are looking for Ruby on Rails developers on many different teams, front-end developers, and on my teams in particular right now, Ruby on Rails, front end, and then also machine learning engineers who have Python experience, and also people working in anti-abuse, especially doing work in Golang. So feel free to reach out to me directly, and ping me on LinkedIn, et cetera, and be happy to talk to you about what roles we have open on my teams and on my peers' teams, and send you off in the right direction so you can review them and decide if you want to apply. Definitely. I'll post a link in the show notes, so that everyone can find it and click and review. Cool. Great. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.